Amid a birthday gala, billionaire magnate Richard Sterling, a man tethered to his work and steeped in solitude, gets a call from Metropolitan Hospital. "Sir, please come immediately. Your daughters have just been born." He scoffs, a disbelieving laugh escaping him, until the nurse on the line whispers a name he thought was lost to memory. Crystal flutes fizzed with champagne, catching the light from a sprawling chandelier as Richard Sterling surveyed the scene from a grand marble staircase, his sharply tailored suit a stark contrast to the hollow look in his grayish-blue eyes. Down below, the main hall of his Sterling estate, was a sea of hundreds of guests in formal attire, their laughter and conversation a constant humming drone that bounced off the gilded walls. A waiter glided by, offering a flute of champagne. Richard accepted it with a mechanical motion, his fingers grazing the platinum of his wristwatch, a limited edition Patek Philippe that was a token from his board of directors. He took a sip, the taste of the vintage Dom Perignon barely registering on his palate. "Happy birthday, Mr. Blackwood," a bright voice broke through his reverie. It was Emily, his personal assistant, radiant in a crimson gown. "The guests are asking when you'll give your speech." Richard gave a slight nod, his gaze sweeping across the opulent hall. There were politicians, celebrities, titans of industry, all convened to celebrate his 45th birthday. Everyone who was anyone was present, except for anyone who genuinely cared. As he descended the stairs, Richard navigated the throng with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being the epicenter of attention. He endured firm handshakes, offered polite smiles, and absorbed empty words of congratulations, a social ballet he knew by heart. "Ethan, my boy," boomed Senator Davis, his ample stomach straining against a silk waistcoat. "That last deal you made in Asia, brilliant. You must be swimming in money now, huh?" Richard manufactured a smile. Just another day at the office, Senator. Slipping away from the senator's suffocating enthusiasm, he found himself before a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the meticulously illuminated gardens. His own reflection stared back at him, graying at the temples, lines etched around his eyes, the face of a man who possessed everything yet had nothing. A light tap on his elbow pulled him from his thoughts. It was Brittany, the current it girl, his companion for the evening, a strategic arrangement by his PR team. "Ethan, darling," she purred, "shall we dance?" He turned, catching the envious stares from other men. Brittany was undeniably stunning, but her green eyes were vacant, her laughter a performance that never reached them. "Sure," he replied, guiding her toward the dance floor. As they swayed to the orchestra's melody, Richard couldn't help but observe the couples surrounding them, intertwined hands, shared glances, authentic smiles, real connections that felt like a world away from his own. When the music concluded, Richard excused himself and headed for the bar. The bartender, anticipating his needs, already had his favorite whiskey waiting, a Macallan 25-year. Richard lifted the glass, catching his reflection again in the mirror behind the bar. For a fleeting moment, he saw past the facade of the successful magnate. He saw the boy who had dreamed of changing the world, the young man who had vowed never to become like his father, cold, distant, and consumed by work. At what point had he morphed into the very man he despised? The sharp clinking of a spoon against a champagne flute sliced through the air. It was time for the speech. Richard walked to the center of the hall, every eye fixed on him. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie. The words came automatically, a well-rehearsed script about success, gratitude, and a vision for the future. "And it is with great pride that I announced the expansion of Blackwood Industries into—" His voice resonated through the hall, but his eyes drifted over smiling faces and impressed expressions, none of whom truly knew him, none who cared for the man behind the empire. Concluding his speech, Richard raised his glass to another year of sterile accomplishments. The crowd applauded, glasses clinked. He drank the whiskey, its burn a welcome distraction in his throat. For a brief second, he closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the full weight of it all. The emptiness, the loneliness, the yearning for something more. When he opened them, his practiced smile was back in place. The party swirled around him, a symphony of laughter, music, and hollow chatter. Richard Sterling, the billionaire magnate, stood at the center of it all, yet he had never felt more profoundly alone. As he braced himself for another round of socializing, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. What news could possibly be important enough to interrupt the birthday party of the man who had everything? He had no idea that this single missed call was poised to shatter his entire world. The phone vibrated again, this time with more insistence. Annoyed by the persistent interruption, Richard frowned. Who would dare to call him repeatedly on his birthday? Excusing himself from a cluster of investors, he moved to a quieter corner of the hall. "Ethan Blackwood," he answered, his tone frigid and professional. "Mr. Blackwood," the voice on the other end was urgent, feminine. "This is Nurse Melissa from Central Hospital. You need to come immediately. Your daughters have just been born." The world seemed to stop. Richard blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "I think there's a mistake. I don't have daughters." "Sir," the nurse insisted, her voice softening slightly. "There's no mistake, twins. They were born 20 minutes ago. The mother, she didn't survive the delivery." Richard felt his knees buckle. He leaned against the nearest wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. "That's impossible, I don't. Who's the mother?" There was a beat of silence on the other end, then almost a whisper. "Olivia?" The name struck Richard like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. A sophisticated bar in New York City, mesmerizing green eyes, laughter under silk sheets. "Olivia," he repeated, his voice barely audible. The bustling party around him faded into nothing. Richard was transported back to that moment, 9 months ago. Flashback. The hotel bar at the plaza was a tranquil oasis after a grueling day of negotiations. Richard loosened his tie, ordering his usual whiskey. That's when he saw her. Ava. Brown hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes seemed to hold entire galaxies. She smiled, and Richard felt something stir deep inside him, something that had been dormant for a very long time. They talked for hours about travel, about dreams, about disappointments. For the first time in years, Richard felt truly alive. When their lips met in the elevator, it was a jolt, as if the city's electricity was suddenly flowing through him. The night that followed was a whirlwind of passion, laughter, and whispered secrets. But when the sun rose, she was gone. No phone number, no last name. Just a note. "Thank you for making me believe in magic again." End of flashback. "Mr. Blackwood, are you still there?" The nurse's voice pulled him back to the present. Richard swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Yes, I'll be there as soon as possible." He hung up, feeling dizzy. Daughters, twins, Ava, gone. The words reeled in his mind, refusing to form a coherent thought. Moving as if in a trance, Richard crossed the hall. Guests greeted him. Glasses were raised in his honor, but he saw and heard none of it. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Emily, his assistant. "Sarah," he called, his voice hoarse. "I need to go now." Her eyes widened with concern. "Ethan, what happened? You're pale." He shook his head, unable to articulate the chaos in his mind. "Cancel everything. Tell them I had a family emergency." Emily's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Richard never mentioned family. Sure. But he was already moving away, ignoring the confused glances and spreading whispers that followed him through the party. In the grand foyer near the entrance, Richard grabbed his coat with trembling hands. Another flashback hit him. Flashback. Ava, wrapped in the hotel sheets, her eyes shining in the dim light of the room. "What's your biggest fear, Ethan?" she'd asked, tracing patterns on his chest. He hesitated, then answered with a surprising honesty. "Becoming like my father, cold distant, putting work above everything and everyone." She looked at him deeply, as if she could see into his very soul. "I think you have more heart than you realize, Ethan Blackwood." End of flashback. Richard blinked, back in reality. His driver was already waiting outside the Sterling estate, alerted by Emily. As the car sped through the city streets of New York, Richard struggled to organize his thoughts. How could Ava have hidden the pregnancy? Why had she never tried to contact him? And now she was gone. The immense weight of responsibility settled upon him. Daughters. He had daughters. 2 babies who had, in the span of minutes, lost their mother and gained a father who didn't even know they existed. Fear mingled with an emotion he couldn't quite place: regret, anticipation, or perhaps hope. The lights of Metropolitan Hospital appeared ahead. Richard took a deep breath, trying to brace himself for what was to come. But how could anyone ever prepare for a moment like this? Exiting the car, he stared up at the imposing building. Somewhere inside, 2 new lives, freshly brought into this world, were waiting for him. 2 little girls who carried his blood, his name, his legacy. With hesitant steps, Richard entered the hospital. The antiseptic smell and the fluorescent lights assaulted his senses, a stark contrast to the luxurious setting he had just left. Here, the rules were different. Here, money and status meant nothing in the face of life's miracles and fragility. At the reception desk, he identified himself, his voice trembling slightly. The receptionist looked at him with a mixture of recognition and compassion. 5th floor, Mr. Blackwood Maternity Wing. Inside the elevator, Richard stared at his reflection in the polished metal doors. The man looking back was a stranger, wide-eyed, his hair disheveled, his tie crooked. Where was the powerful CEO now? The doors slid open, and Richard stepped out into a hallway that seemed to stretch on for miles. Each step brought him closer to a reality he hadn't known existed an hour ago. A nurse approached, her gaze kind. "Mr. Blackwood." He nodded, unable to form words. "Please come with me," she said gently. Following her, Richard's heart pounded. The world around him felt surreal, as if he might wake up at any moment to find it was all just a bizarre dream. The nurse stopped in front of a large window. On the other side was a room with several incubators. Richard moved closer, his eyes scanning the tiny cribs until there they were. 2 little figures, side by side. So tiny, so fragile, so perfect. "Your daughters, Mr. Blackwood," the nurse said softly. Richard placed his hand on the glass as if he could reach through it. A tidal wave of emotion crashed over him, something he had never experienced before. It felt as if his heart was physically expanding, filling spaces he never knew were empty. "Olivia," he whispered, thinking of the woman who gave her life to bring these 2 children into the world. "I'm so sorry. I'll take care of them, I promise." In that moment, watching his newborn daughters, Richard Sterling knew his life would never be the same. The profound emptiness he'd felt at his birthday party now seemed like a distant memory. A new chapter was about to begin, a chapter of challenges, fears, and, he hoped, unconditional love. Richard remained motionless before the nursery window, his eyes transfixed on the 2 miniature forms on the other side. The world around him seemed to decelerate, the hospital's ambient sounds fading into a muted hum. "Mr. Blackwood," the gentle voice of the nurse brought him back. "The doctor would like to speak with you." He nodded mechanically, unable to pull his gaze from the twins. His daughters. The word resonated in his mind, both alien and deeply resonant. Dr. Anderson, a middle-aged man with compassionate eyes, waited for him in a small office. Richard sat, his legs suddenly feeling like lead. "Mr. Blackwood," and first of all, 10 congratulations, the doctor began, his tone gentle, yet serious. "Your daughters were born healthy, though a bit premature. They'll need to stay in the NQ for a few weeks, but the prognosis is excellent." Richard nodded, trying to absorb the information. "And Olivia?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Anderson's gaze fell. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, we did everything we could, but there were complications during delivery. Miss Thompson did not survive." The news struck Richard like a physical blow. Ava, dead. The woman he barely knew, who had nevertheless turned his life upside down in a single night, was gone forever. How did that happen?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. The doctor explained the medical details of a postpartum hemorrhage and other complications, but the words were a blur. Instead, flashes of their night together filled Richard's thoughts. Flashback. Ava, throwing her head back as she laughed at something he said. The sparkle in her eyes when she spoke of her dreams of seeing the world. The impossible softness of her skin under his fingertips. End of flashback. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Anderson's voice pulled him back. There are a few matters we need to discuss. Richard straightened in his chair, trying to summon his composure. Yes, of course. The girls will need care in the coming weeks, and there's the matter of birth certificates documentation. Reality began to crash down. He wasn't just a father now. He was a single father to premature twin girls. I don't know anything about babies, Richard admitted, a wave of panic rising in his throat. Dr. Anderson offered a reassuring smile. No new parent does, Mr. Blackwood, but we have an excellent team here to guide you and about the paperwork. Richard nodded, his mind a vortex of documents, records, proof of paternity. The press would have a field day with this. I'll do whatever is necessary, he said firmly, the conviction in his own voice surprising him. After receiving more guidance, Richard found himself back in the maternity ward hallway. His feet led him back to the NICU window. The twins were there, small and perfect, in their incubators. A nurse approached, smiling kindly. Would you like to meet them, Mr. Blackwood? Richard hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded. After donning a sterile gown, he was led into the NICU. The gentle, rhythmic beeping of monitors and the clean, antiseptic smell filled the air. Stopping between the two incubators, Richard looked at his daughters for the first time without a layer of glass between them. They were so small, so fragile. The wires and sensors attached to them seemed to dwarf their tiny bodies. Yet they were the most beautiful creatures he had ever seen. They're identical, the nurse said softly. But this one, she pointed to the baby on the left, has a small birthmark behind her ear. Richard leaned in, noticing the minuscule, crescent-shaped mark. Without thinking, he reached out a hand, his finger gently brushing against the baby's cheek. She moved her tiny hand reflexively, her fingers closing around his. In that instant, the reality of it all hit him with its full, undeniable force. These were his daughters, his blood, his responsibility. 2 lives entirely dependent on him. A flood of emotions washed over him, fear, joy, sorrow, hope. Tears he hadn't realized he was holding back began to stream down his face. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I'm your dad." The other twin stirred, as if responding to his voice. Richard turned to her, feeling an immediate, inexplicable connection to them both. "They'll need names," the nurse added gently. Names. Richard blinked, realizing he hadn't even thought about that. He had barely had time to process being a father, let alone naming his children. I don't know," he admitted. Maybe Olivia had something in mind. The mention of Ava brought a fresh wave of grief. How could she have kept this from him? Why hadn't she ever reached out? And now she was gone, leaving him with 1,000 unanswered questions and 2 lives to raise. As he watched the twins, Richard found himself grappling with questions he had never imagined. What kind of father would he be? How would he balance his all-consuming professional life with fatherhood? And most importantly, how would he raise these girls without their mother? The fear of the responsibility warred with a burgeoning sense of protectiveness and love. These tiny, innocent, vulnerable creatures depended on him now. The idea was terrifying and, at the same time, strangely liberating. "Mr. Blackwood," the nurse interrupted his thoughts, "we need to run some routine tests. Why don't you get some rest? You can come back to see them in a few hours." Reluctantly, Richard nodded. He didn't want to leave them, but he knew he needed time to process everything. Leaving the NICU, he was back in the sterile hospital corridor. The world outside kept spinning, oblivious to the seismic shift in his life. His phone buzzed dozens of missed calls and messages, his old life clamoring for his attention. But as he walked toward the exit, Richard knew nothing would ever be the same. In a matter of hours, he had become a father, lost a woman who might have been the love of his life, and been confronted with the greatest challenge he'd ever known. The questions swirled in his mind. How had Ava kept the pregnancy a secret? Why had she never contacted him? What did the future hold for him and his daughters? Yet, amid the doubt and fear, a single certainty began to form in Richard Sterling's heart. He would do everything in his power to be the father these girls deserved, the man Ava, in their brief encounter, had glimpsed he could be. As he left the hospital, Richard knew he was leaving behind not just the place where his daughters were born, but also the man he used to be. A new chapter was beginning, filled with challenges, mysteries, and, he hoped, unconditional love. Richard sank into the supple leather seat of his car, feeling both physically and emotionally hollowed out. As his driver navigated the late-night city streets, his mind drifted back to that one night, 9 months ago. Flashback. The Plaza Hotel in New York was a sanctuary of gilded luxury and quiet elegance. Richard straightened his tie as he stepped out of a conference room after a marathon day of negotiations. His head throbbed with market figures, contractual obligations, and promises of global market dominance. He briefly considered ordering room service, but something, perhaps boredom, perhaps an acute sense of loneliness, drew him down to the hotel bar instead. The atmosphere was refined, with soft lighting glinting off dark wood and polished brass. That was when he saw her. She was sitting alone at the bar, a simple navy blue dress hugging her form. Her long, elegant fingers played absently with the rim of a glass of red wine. There was an aura about her, something enigmatic and magnetic that immediately snared Richard's attention. Without a second thought, he approached. "Is this seat taken?" Richard asked, gesturing to the empty stool beside her. She looked up, and Richard felt as if he'd been struck by a benign form of lightning. Her eyes were the greenest, most intense eyes he had ever seen, framed by long lashes and a single arched eyebrow raised in curiosity. "Depends," she replied, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Are you interesting enough to occupy it?" Richard laughed, surprised and intrigued by her confident response. "Ethan Blackwood," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "And I promise to be at least marginally interesting." "Olivia," she responded, shaking his hand. The contact sent a strange current up his arm. Just Olivia. The hours that followed melted away in a blur of conversation, laughter, and an undeniable, crackling chemistry. Ava was an enigma, skillfully deflecting questions about her personal life, but captivating in every word she spoke. She talked about art, philosophy, and faraway places with a passion that Richard rarely encountered in his world of cold, calculated business. "What's your greatest dream?" "Ethan Blackwood," Ava asked at some point, her green eyes piercing his as if she could read his very soul. Richard hesitated. In any other situation, he would have delivered a scripted answer about market expansion or technological innovation. But something about Ava made him want to be authentic. "Honestly, I'm not sure anymore," he admitted. "I've spent so long chasing success that I've forgotten to define what I really want." Ava smiled, a knowing expression that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to truly find us ourselves." The tension between them was palpable, electric. When Ava suggested they go up to her room, there was no hesitation. The elevator doors had barely closed before they were in each other's arms, the kiss intense and passionate, as if both were trying to quench a thirst they hadn't known they possessed. In the room, clothes were shed with an urgent haste. Richard found himself exploring every inch of Ava's body, memorizing every curve, every sound she made. It was more than just physical desire. It was a connection, a resonance he had never experienced before. Later, tangled in the rumpled sheets, Ava lazily traced patterns on Richard's chest. "You know," she murmured, "I think there's more to you than just a business tycoon Ethan Blackwood." He pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his. "And there's more to you than you're willing to reveal, Olivia, no last name." She laughed, a sound that was both musical and mysterious. "Maybe it's better this way. Keep them eye." They talked until dawn, sharing stories, dreams, and fears. Richard felt more alive, more himself, than he had in years. When they finally fell asleep, the first rays of sunlight were already painting the New York skyline. Richard woke a few hours later, feeling surprisingly refreshed despite the lack of sleep. But the other side of the bed was cold, empty. "Olivia," he called out, sitting up. No answer. Rising, Richard walked around the room. There was no sign of her or any of her belongings. It was as if the entire night had been nothing more than a vivid, beautiful dream. That's when he saw a folded piece of paper on the bedside table. His heart pounding, he opened it. "Ethan, thank you for a night. I'll never forget you made me believe in magic again. Remember, sometimes we have to lose ourselves to truly find ourselves." Richard reread the note several times, a mixture of emotions churning inside him. Disappointment that she had left, gratitude for the night they shared, and a strange, profound sense that something fundamental had shifted within him. End of flashback. Back in the present, Richard found himself staring out at the city through the car window. The weeks that followed that night had been a whirlwind of emotion and desperate action. He had combed the hotel for any information about Ava, but she seemed to have vanished into thin air. No checkout record, no security camera footage capturing her departure. Richard hired private investigators, leveraged his vast network of business contacts, but Ava remained a ghost, a woman with no last name, no past, and no future, just one magical night, etched permanently into his memory. Over time, the frantic search had given way to a reluctant acceptance. Perhaps Ava had been right. Maybe the mystery was part of the magic. But now, 9 months later, everything had changed. Ava wasn't just a bittersweet memory of a passionate night. She was the mother of his daughters, a woman who had carried 2 lives for 9 months, faced childbirth alone, and then left this world, leaving behind a legacy Richard could scarcely comprehend. The car pulled up in front of Richard's sprawling Sterling estate. Climbing out, he gazed at the imposing structure that had always been his sanctuary and a symbol of his success. Now it felt strangely empty, hollow, and inadequate. As he walked inside, Richard wondered how a single night, a single encounter, could so profoundly alter the course of an entire life. Ava had entered his world like a comet, brilliant and fleeting, leaving behind a trail of light and 2 tiny lives that now depended entirely on him. Her words echoed in his mind. "Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to truly find ourselves." Richard Sterling, the business magnate who always had a plan, now found himself utterly and completely lost. And maybe, he thought as he opened his front door, that was exactly where he needed to be in order to finally find himself. Morning arrived far too quickly for Richard. He had barely closed his eyes, his mind a maelstrom of thoughts and emotions. The piercing ring of the phone yanked him from a fitful, restless sleep. "Mr. Blackwood," Emily's tense voice came through the line. "The lawyers and P-team are waiting in the conference room. The press, well, they're going crazy." Richard sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Dressing mechanically, he wondered how his life had been turned completely upside down in less than 24 hours. A father of twins. The words still sounded foreign, surreal in his mind. The conference room was at capacity when he arrived, familiar faces staring at him with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. Michael, his chief counsel, spoke first. "Ethan, we need to discuss the legal implications of this situation, as though his daughters were merely another business problem to be managed." "Are the children yours?" asked Rebecca, the PR director, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Richard hesitated for a moment. "Yes," he finally answered. "There's no doubt." A low murmur rippled through the room. Michael cleared his throat. Then we must consider paternity tests, custody agreements." "Custody?" Richard interrupted, frowning. "The mother has passed away. Whose custody would it be otherwise?" "There's always the possibility of maternal relatives stepping forward," Michael explained patiently. "We have to prepare for all eventualities." Rebecca chimed in, "The most urgent matter is how we'll handle the press billionaire tycoon discovers he's the father of twins is a headline that's already circulating. We need an official statement." Richard felt a surge of profound annoyance. A statement my daughters were just born, and they lost their mother. They not a PR opportunity. "Ethan," Emily said gently, "I understand this is personal, but it does have implications for the company. The shareholders are nervous. We need a plan." A plan? Richard almost laughed. How could he possibly plan for something that had completely dismantled his world? What if one of the board members began hesitantly? What if we considered other options? Adoption, maybe your life isn't exactly set up for single parenthood. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt a wave of anger and a fierce protectiveness that surprised even himself. "No," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "They're my daughters. It's not up for discussion." The meeting dragged on for hours. Legal strategies, press releases, the complete reorganization of Richard's schedule. But his mind was elsewhere, back at the hospital with the two tiny lives that were now entirely reliant on him. When it was finally over, Richard felt utterly exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The twins were being discharged, and he needed to bring them home. The Sterling estate, always so silent and meticulously orderly, suddenly felt inadequate and even intimidating. Richard watched, half-dazed, as a team of professionals swiftly converted one of the lavish guest suites into a makeshift nursery. When the hospital car arrived, Richard's heart raced. 2 nurses stepped out, each carrying a small, precious bundle. This was real. It was happening. With trembling hands, Richard took one of the babies. She was so tiny, so delicate. Her eyes opened for a moment, and in them Richard saw Ava's green. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm your dad." The first few nights were a trial by fire. Richard, who was used to surviving on minimal sleep for work, discovered a whole new level of profound exhaustion. The twins seemed to operate on a tag-team schedule of crying, demanding constant attention. Changing diapers became a complex strategic challenge, and feeding them with bottles was an art form he struggled desperately to master. More than once, Richard found himself just staring at their sleeping faces, wondering if he was doing anything right. On the 3rd night, after finally managing to get both of them to sleep, Richard collapsed into an armchair in the nursery. The sudden silence felt almost deafening. His gaze fell on a small box on the dresser. Inside, carefully folded, was the note Ava had left that morning in New York City. Richard picked it up, rereading the words that now seemed to carry a whole new weight and meaning. "Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to truly find ourselves." A soft, humorless laugh escaped his lips. Lost. Yes, he certainly felt lost. Lost in a sea of responsibilities he had never known he'd have, in emotions he didn't know he was capable of possessing. As he looked at the 2 cribs, something in his chest warmed. Perhaps in this moment of total disorientation, he was closer to finding himself than he had ever been before. His phone buzzed more messages from the PR team, more interview requests, more crises to manage. Richard stared at the device for a long moment, then powered it off. In that instant, he made a decision. The outside world, with all its expectations and judgments, could wait. Here, in this room, were the 2 people who now mattered more than anything else. Richard stood, moving to the cribs. He gently touched each baby's cheek. "I promise," he whispered. "I'll do my best. I don't know exactly how to be a father, but I'll learn for you for Olivia." The next few hours blurred into a cycle of bottles, diapers, and off-key lullabies. When the sun finally rose, it found Richard asleep in the armchair, one baby cradled in each arm. Emily found him there a few hours later when she came to check why he wasn't answering her calls. "Ethan," she called softly, hesitant to wake him. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the morning light. For a moment he looked confused, then he glanced down at the babies in his arms and smiled. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse with sleep but resolute, "cancel my commitments for the next few weeks, in fact rearrange my entire schedule." She looked at him, surprised. "But there's a board meeting, the new product launch." "They can wait," Richard interrupted gently. "I have something more important to do now." Emily watched as Richard stood, carefully placing each baby back in her crib with a tenderness she had never seen in him before. "They need names," Richard murmured, more to himself than to Emily. Turning to his assistant, he smiled a genuine smile that lit up his tired face. "Sarah, help me find the best nannies, pediatricians, and anything else babies might need, and schedule a press conference for next week." "A press conference?" Emily asked, surprised. Richard nodded, his gaze returning to the cribs. "Yes, it's time the world meets the newest members of the Blackwood W family." In that moment, watching Richard with his daughters, Emily understood. The powerful CEO, the ruthless businessman, was gone. In his place stood a father, learning to navigate a new world of love and responsibility. And for the first time in years, Richard Sterling looked truly at peace. Richard's office, once a sleek sanctuary of corporate strategy, now resembled the command center of a complex investigation. Maps, photos, and documents covered the walls, transforming the elegant space into something out of a detective's private hideout. At the center of it all was Richard, his tired eyes fixed on a photo of Ava, the only one he had, discreetly captured by a New York hotel security camera. Beside him, Mike Murphy, a former FBI agent turned private investigator, flipped through a thick file. "Mr. Blackwood," Mike began in his gravelly voice, "we have a few leads, but Olivia Thompson might as well be a ghost." Richard sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Tell me what we've got." Mike opened a map on the table. "After Tokyo, we traced credit card movements to Bali, then Australia the trail goes cold for a few weeks, then reappears in Buenos Aires." "That doesn't make sense," Richard muttered. "Why all the moving around?" "There's more," Mike continued. "In each location, she used a different name. Olivia Thompson, Sophie Grant, Emma Clark, the list goes on." A pang of sorrow hit Richard's chest. Who was this woman who had captured his heart that night in New York? "We need to visit these places," Richard decided, his voice firm. "Maybe we'll find someone who knew her who can give us more information." Mike nodded, though his face showed a professional skepticism. "We already have a team on the ground, but your presence might open doors normally closed." In the weeks that followed, Richard embarked on a frantic, globe-trotting journey. In Miami, he walked the vibrant streets of South Beach, where Ava had been, showing her photo to cafe owners and hotel staff. "Oh yes," exclaimed an old Cuban coffee vendor, the young woman with green eyes. She'd spent hours sitting here staring at the sea. She looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. In a trendy Los Angeles cafe, a waitress remembered her. Sophie, of course, she came every day, always ordering ginger tea, said it helped with her morning sickness. I thought she was pregnant, but never asked. Each tiny piece of information was like a fragment of a complex mosaic. The more Richard learned about Ava, the less he felt he understood her. In Santa Fe, his search led him to a small, dusty art gallery. The elderly owner, a man with kind, knowing eyes, recognized the photo immediately. "Emma," he sighed. "A talented artist, she stayed here a few weeks painting her works, were intense, full of emotion." Richard glanced around, hopeful. "Are any of her paintings still here?" The man shook his head sadly. "She took them all when she left, said they were too personal to sell." Frustrated, Richard left the gallery. Every new clue only led to more questions. Why was Ava traveling so much? Why the cascade of fake names? And why, knowing she was pregnant, had she never contacted him? Back at his hotel in Santa Fe, Richard received a call from Emily. "The twins are fine," she assured him before he could even ask. "But Ethan, how much longer can this go on? The company needs you. The girls need you." Richard closed his eyes, feeling the immense weight of his dual responsibilities. "I know, Sarah. I just need a few more leads I need to understand." "Understand what exactly?" Emily asked gently. "Will it change anything to know why she did what she did?" The question struck Richard like a punch to the gut. Why was he so obsessed with uncovering Ava's past? Would the answers bring her back? Would they change the fact that he was now a father to two girls who needed him? That night, unable to sleep, Richard pored over all the information they had gathered. Ava, or whatever her real name might be, seemed to be on a journey. Was she running from something or searching for something? One detail caught his attention. In every city she visited, she left behind an artistic mark. A quick sketch for the vendor in Miami, a small watercolor for the waitress in L.A., the paintings in Santa Fe. With a sudden burst of inspiration, Richard grabbed his phone. "Jack, I need you to look into something in every city." Olivia stayed check for art galleries, exhibits, anything related to art that took place while she was there. Hours later, Mike called back with a list. Indeed, in every city, there had been artistic events coinciding with Ava's presence. "It's interesting," Mike commented, "but it doesn't tell us much about who she really was." Richard, however, felt he was finally onto something. Ava was an artist, if not professionally, then by passion. It was central to who she was. Remembering that night in New York, Richard recalled how her eyes had lit up when she spoke of art and beauty, how she viewed the world in a way he, chained to the corporate world, could barely comprehend. With a heavy sigh, Richard realized that, as much as he desperately wanted answers, he might never fully understand Ava's choices. Why she'd kept the pregnancy hidden, why she'd traveled so restlessly, why she'd used so many different names. But he understood something crucial. Ava was complex, passionate, and possibly haunted by something in her past. And for reasons he might never know, she had chosen to leave this legacy, her daughters, in his care. Staring at Ava's photo once more, Richard made a decision. It was time to stop chasing ghosts and focus on the present, on the two small lives that were depending on him. "Jack," he said to the investigator, "call off the search. We have enough. Are you sure, Mr. Blackwood, there are still so many unanswered questions?" Richard nodded, feeling a great weight lift from his shoulders. "Yes, I'm sure some questions may never be answered, and maybe that's how it should be." That night, on his flight home, Richard reflected on everything he had uncovered. Ava remained a mystery in many ways, but he felt he knew her a little better now. She was a free spirit, an artist, a woman who saw beauty where others did not. And for one brief, magical night, she had shared that vision with him. Now it was his responsibility to pass that legacy on, to teach his daughters to see the world through an artist's eyes, to seek beauty and meaning in the most unexpected places. As the plane touched down, Richard felt an anticipation he hadn't felt in weeks. He was going home to his daughters, to the new life that awaited him. Ava's mystery would remain partially unsolved, but Richard realized that might be the beauty of it all. Like a great work of art, not everything needed to be explained to be appreciated and cherished. With that thought, he left the airport, eager to hold his daughters and begin the next chapter of his life, a chapter brimming with possibilities, challenges, and above all, love. The Plaza Hotel in New York rose majestically against the night sky, its illuminated windows like a beacon in the city's vast landscape. Richard Sterling pushed through the revolving doors, feeling a strange mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. 9 months had passed since that fateful night, but the memory remained vivid, almost tangible. The lobby looked nearly identical, the same polished marble, the same elaborate floral arrangements. Richard could almost see his past self crossing that very space, exhausted after a long day of deals, completely unaware of how his life was about to be irrevocably changed. "Welcome back, Mr. Blackwood," the manager greeted him warmly. "Your suite is ready." Richard nodded distractedly, his eyes scanning the room for what, exactly? A glimpse of Ava? Some sign he might have missed? The bar, Richard began hesitantly. Does it still have the same bartender as 9 months ago? The manager seemed surprised, but nodded. Yes, Hosen is still with us. He's on duty tonight, if you'd like to speak with him. A few hours later, Richard found himself on the same bar stool where it had all begun. Tony, a middle-aged man with sharp, observant eyes, watched him curiously while preparing his drink. "Do you remember me?" Richard asked, showing him the photo of Ava. "I was here 9 months ago with this woman." Tony studied the picture for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Ah, yes, hard to forget you two had, how do I say, electric chemistry." Richard felt his heart race. "Do you recall anything else about her, any detail?" The bartender frowned, thinking. "She arrived before you looked worried, made several calls speaking in a language I didn't recognize, not English or Japanese." This was new information. Ava, agitated and speaking an unknown tongue. The mystery deepened. In the following days, Richard scoured New York City like a man possessed. He visited every place he and Ava had mentioned that night, a small cafe in Greenwich Village where she claimed to have tasted the best matcha of her life, an art gallery in Chelsea she'd wanted to see. At each location, Richard showed Ava's photo, hoping someone would remember her. But the city kept its secrets, and Ava remained an enigma. One afternoon, seated on a park bench, watching the city life buzz around him, Richard allowed himself to relive the memories of that night. Ava's laughter, the soft touch of her hand, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of her passions. That was when the realization hit him with full force. That night hadn't just changed his life because of the twins. It had awakened something deep within him, stirring feelings and desires that had been long buried. For the first time in years, Richard confronted his own demons. His obsession with work, his fear of intimacy, his constant, suffocating need for control. Ava, in just a few hours, had shattered all his carefully constructed defenses. "What did you do to me, Olivia?" he murmured to the breeze, feeling a mixture of gratitude and pain. Back at the hotel, Richard was preparing for another night without answers when his phone rang. It was Mike, the investigator. "Mr. Blackwood, we found something a lead on Olivia's whereabouts in the months before the birth." Richard's heart leaped. What where? A small coastal town in the south of France, Espal de Vence. "We have reports of a woman matching Olivia's description living there for several months, right up until a few weeks before the twins were born." Richard's head spun. Carmel by the sea. What was Ava doing there? "There's more," Mike added. "She went by the name Claire Dubois and worked at a local art studio." Richard closed his eyes, absorbing the information. Claire Dubois, another name to add to Ava's list of identities. But the part about the art studio resonated deeply with what he'd learned of her passion for art. "Jack, send someone to St. Paul de Vence right away. I want every detail of her time there, no matter how small." After hanging up, Richard stood at the window of his suite, staring out at the glittering lights of New York. The city that had witnessed the start of this story now seemed to offer him a new path. He thought of the twins waiting for him back home, how their lives were forever intertwined with this mysterious woman who had touched his soul in just one night. The search for Ava had become more than just a quest for answers. It was a journey of self-discovery, a confrontation with his past, and a bridge to his future. Grabbing his phone again, Richard made a call. "Sarah, I need you to arrange something. I'm going to France." As he prepared for this next step in his search, Richard reflected on how a single encounter could change the course of an entire life. Ava had entered his world like a comet, brilliant and brief, leaving behind a trail of questions and 2 precious lives. Now, with this new lead, Richard felt closer than ever to unraveling Ava's mystery. More importantly, he felt closer to understanding himself and the man he wanted to become for his daughters. With a final glance at the city that had witnessed the beginning of it all, Richard made a silent promise to Ava, to his daughters, and to himself. He would find the answers he sought, no matter the cost. And perhaps along the way he would finally learn to embrace the unexpected beauty that can arise from the most improbable moments. A sharp cry sliced through the pre-dawn silence, pulling Richard from a light, restless sleep. He rose automatically, his eyes still heavy, and walked over to the crib. Grace, the twin with the tiny birthmark behind her ear, was stirring restlessly. "Shh, it's okay, Princess," Richard murmured, lifting her gently. The scent of baby powder and warm milk surrounded him, a world away from the leather and coffee aromas of his work-filled nights. As he prepared her bottle with a newfound practiced skill, Richard reflected on how drastically his life had transformed in the past few weeks. The powerful CEO who once spent his nights closing multi-million-dollar deals now found himself an expert in the subtle differences between size 1 and size 2 diapers. Grace calmed as soon as she felt the bottle's nipple, her tiny fingers instinctively wrapping around Richard's. He smiled, marveling at the perfection of the little being in his arms. From the other crib, Chloe began to stir, as if sensing her sister's absence. She opened her eyes, meeting Richard's gaze. "Hey there, little one," he whispered, leaning over to caress her chubby cheek. To his surprise and utter delight, Chloe responded with a drowsy, toothless smile, her first real smile. Richard's heart soared. Of all the professional triumphs and corporate victories he had ever achieved, none could compare to the pure, unadulterated joy of that single moment. The weeks that followed were a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries. Richard, who had once delegated even the simplest personal tasks, now found himself completely immersed in a world of baby schedules, pediatric visits, and sleepless nights. His massive polished desk, once covered in contracts and financial reports, now served as a makeshift changing station. The walk-in closet that once housed rows of expensive suits was now filled with colorful onesies and tiny soft dresses. One morning, as he was attempting to feed both twins at once, a feat of coordination that still challenged him, Richard was caught off guard by Emily, who entered the room with a stack of documents. "Ethan, I need your signature on," she paused, taking in the chaotic scene. Richard, a twin in each arm, precariously balanced bottles, and a suspicious stain on his shirt that was definitely not coffee. "Maybe I can come back later," Emily offered, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Richard nodded gratefully. "Please and Sarah cancel my afternoon meetings. We have a pediatric appointment." As the days turned into weeks, Richard surprised himself with the small, fundamental shifts in his own behavior. Success was no longer defined solely by market share and profit margins. He now found himself celebrating every tiny milestone in the girl's development. Chloe's first laugh, the day Grace managed to hold her own bottle, the first time they both slept through the night, a miracle for which Richard was immensely grateful. His priorities were reordering themselves, and he could feel it in every fiber of his being. Board meetings, once the pinnacle of his worry list, now seemed trivial compared to his daughter's well-being. One afternoon, while playing with the twins on a soft rug on the living room floor, Richard reflected on the values he wanted to instill in them. Success, of course, but not just the financial or career-driven kind. He wanted them to value compassion, creativity, and love. He thought of Ava, of the passion she had shown for art and for life. He wanted his daughters to have that same spark, that same ability to see the inherent beauty in the world. "I'll take you to museums," he promised softly, watching the twins babble to each other in their own secret language. "We'll travel, discover different cultures. I'll show you there's more to life than balance sheets and contracts." That night, after finally lulling them to sleep, Richard allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. He picked up the single photo he had of Ava, the one captured by the hotel camera, and studied it. "Thank you," he whispered to the image. "For them, for showing me a side of life I'd forgotten existed." The soft sound of the baby monitor drew his attention. Chloe was stirring, likely ready for her midnight bottle. Richard smiled, setting the photo back on the nightstand. As he rose to tend to his daughter, he realized something profound. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The challenges of parenthood, the sleepless nights, the moments of pure, unbridled joy with the twins, each had awakened something inside him that had lain dormant for far too long. Richard Sterling, the business magnate, was changing. And while the road ahead was uncertain and filled with challenges, he couldn't wait to see where this journey would lead him. With one last glance at the cribs where his daughters slept peacefully, Richard made a silent promise. He would be the best father he could possibly be, not perfect, but present, loving, and dedicated. And maybe in the process, he would also become the best version of himself. The late afternoon sun bathed the cobbled streets of Carmel by the Sea in a golden light, casting long shadows that danced across charming storybook facades. Richard walked thoughtfully, his footsteps echoing in the narrow alleys. The picturesque beauty of the place clashed sharply with the turmoil raging in his heart. Over the last 48 hours since arriving in California, every new discovery about Ava had opened a Pandora's box of emotions and questions. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to learn. His phone vibrated. It was Mike, the investigator. "Mr. Blackwood, we found something Olivia, or rather CLA Dubois, had regular appointments at a clinic in Nee. It's an oncology center. The Mayo Clinic." Richard felt the world spin. Oncology. The word reverberated in his mind, heavy with terrible implications. "I'm on my way," he managed, barely disguising the tremor in his voice. The Mayo Clinic was a sprawling, modern campus, its glass facade reflecting the clear Midwestern sky. Richard walked in, feeling as if he were trespassing on Ava's most private moments, but he had to know. Dr. Elizabeth Wilson, a middle-aged oncologist with kind, gentle eyes, received him in her office. Richard had used all his influence and resources to secure this meeting. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice soft but professional, "I understand your concerned bee, but I must remind you of patient confidentiality." Richard interrupted, his voice raw. "Please, doctor, she was the mother of my daughters. She died in childbirth. I need to understand." Something in Richard's tone, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, seemed to soften the doctor's professional stance. She sighed deeply. "CLA, or Olivia, as you knew her, came to us shortly after discovering she was pregnant. She had an aggressive lymphoma. The prognosis was not good." Richard felt as if all the air had been knocked out of him. But she went through with the pregnancy." Dr. Wilson nodded gravely. "Against all medical advice, we offered treatments that might have prolonged her life, but they would have required terminating the pregnancy. She refused outright." The full weight of Ava's sacrifice hit Richard like a tidal wave. She had chosen to give life to their daughters, fully aware that it would likely mean her own death. "Did she suffer?" Richard asked, fearing the answer. The doctor hesitated. "The last few months were challenging, but Olivia was incredibly strong. She underwent experimental treatments, anything to stay healthy enough to carry the pregnancy as far as possible." Richard closed his eyes, imagining Ava enduring all of that, completely alone. Why hadn't she reached out? Why carry this immense burden by herself? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Wilson continued, "She spoke of you know not by name, but she mentioned the father of the children, said he was a good man who would give the girls the life she couldn't." Tears Richard hadn't realized he was holding back began to fall freely. "I would have been by her side. I would have done anything." The doctor placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She knew that, but Olivia, she was extraordinary. She said she didn't want you to see her like that she wanted you to remember her as she was that night in Tokyo." After the meeting, Richard wandered aimlessly through the streets of Rochester, his mind a whirlwind of grief and admiration. Eventually, he found himself on a deserted park bench, the gentle breeze a stark contrast to the storm in his heart. He pulled out his phone, looking at the photo of his twins set as his wallpaper. Grace and Chloe. So small, so precious. Ava's final, beautiful gift. With trembling fingers, he dialed Emily's number. "Ethan, is everything okay?" His assistant's worried voice came through. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to do something for me. Find the best lymphoma specialist in the world. I want to make a substantial donation to research and reach out to organizations that support single mothers with cancer. I want to help." There was a pause on the other end. When Emily spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Consider it done. Ethan and the girls miss you. They ask for you." Richard smiled through his tears. "Tell them Daddy's coming home. I have stories to tell them about their mother." That night, in his hotel room, Richard allowed himself to truly cry for the first time since it all began. He wept for Ava, for her courage, for her sacrifice. He wept for his daughters, who would never know the extraordinary woman who brought them into this world. And he wept for himself, for the lost time, the unasked questions, and the choices that were never his to make. But amid the pain, a new determination took root. Ava had given everything for their daughters. Now it was his turn to honor that sacrifice. Pulling out a sheet of hotel stationery, Richard began to write. Not a contract or a business memo, but a letter. A letter to Grace and Chloe, telling them the story of their mother, a brave, beautiful woman who found art in the world, who loved deeply, and who made the most selfless choice anyone could ever make. As the words flowed, Richard felt a profound shift inside him. The man who had arrived in Minnesota searching for answers was not the same man who was now preparing to go home. He had been transformed by the truth, by Ava's sacrifice, by her unconditional love. Gazing out the window at the distant lights of the city, Richard made a silent promise. He would live a life worthy of Ava's sacrifice. He would raise their daughters with love, compassion, and an appreciation for the world's beauty. And above all, he would ensure Ava's legacy. Her love, her courage, her art lived on through Grace and Chloe. With a deep sigh, Richard closed his eyes, feeling more at peace than he had in a very long time. Tomorrow he would return home to his daughters, ready to fully embrace his role as a father and as the keeper of Ava's memory. The future was uncertain, but one thing was crystal clear. Ava's love, brief as it was, had changed everything. And Richard Sterling was determined to honor that love every single day for the rest of his life. The sun had barely risen when Richard arrived at Metropolitan Hospital. The maternity corridor, once a place of anxiety and shock for him, now felt filled with a palpable, profound sadness. A nurse led him to a small back room where Ava's belongings had been stored. "Here you are, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, handing him a cardboard box. Everything she had with her. Richard nodded his thanks, his throat too tight to speak. He sat in a nearby chair, the box heavy on his lap, as if it contained far more than just a few personal items. With trembling hands, he began to sift through the contents. A neatly folded dress, a pair of well-worn flats, a small makeup bag. Each item felt like a story, a fragment of Ava's life he had barely known. At the bottom of the box, his fingers touched something made of leather. Pulling it out, Richard realized it was a journal. The pages were slightly warped, as if they had been wet and dried multiple times. He hesitated. Reading Ava's journal felt like a profound invasion of her privacy. But she was gone, and this might be the only way to understand her choices, to truly know the mother of his daughters. With a deep breath, Richard opened the journal. The first entry instantly transported him back to that night in New York. "Tonight night, I met a man who made my heart remember how to beat Ethan Blackwood. Never thought a single night could hold so much magic, so much promise for a moment. I forgot it, all my past, my fears, my loneliness. For the first time in years, I let myself dream of a future." Richard felt tears welling in his eyes. He turned the page, hungry for more. The next entry, dated just a week later, made his heart sink. "The universe has a cruel sense of humor. I had barely started to dream again, and now lymphoma terminal doctors say maybe months a year with aggressive treatment. How can life give with one hand and take with the other so quickly? The following pages detailed Ava's internal struggle, her initial desire to contact Richard, fighting against her fear of ruining the perfection of that single, magical night they had shared. I think about calling Ethan every day. I imagine how it would feel to hear his voice, to have his support, but then I remember the sparkle in his eyes when he talked about the future, his ambitions. How can I barge into his life just to announce my imminent departure? Richard had to pause, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped the journal. He wanted to scream, to go back in time, to tell Ava he would have been there for her no matter what. He read on, reaching the moment that changed everything. Pregnant with twins, the universe truly has a unique sense of humor. Just when I learn my life is ending, I'm given the chance to create life. Doctors say continuing the pregnancy will drastically reduce my survival chances. But how can I deny these little lives their chance to exist? The pages that followed were a testament to Ava's unbelievable courage and determination. She described in detail her decision to continue the pregnancy, the experimental treatments she pursued to stay healthy for as long as possible, and her thoughts about the future she would never get to see. I think of my girls every day, wondering what they'll be like, who they'll become part of me. Aches knowing I won't be there to watch them grow, but another part rejoices, knowing I'll leave a piece of me in this world through them. Richard sobbed openly now, tears staining the journal's fragile pages. Ava's sacrifice, her bravery in the face of certain death, was overwhelming. One of the final entries hit him like a punch to the chest. Sometimes when I'm still, I feel the girls move inside me and think of Ethan. I imagine how he'll be as a father, teaching them to walk, reading them stories, soothing them after nightmares. I know I made the right choice, not telling him Ethan deserves to embrace the joy of fatherhood without the shadow of my illness. I hope one day he understands and forgives my decision. Richard closed the journal, unable to continue. His entire body shook with the sobs he could no longer contain. The enormity of Ava's love and her sacrifice washed over him. She had chosen to give life to their daughters, knowing it meant giving up her own. She had endured months of pain and uncertainty, completely alone, all to ensure her daughters would have a chance at life. For a long moment, Richard sat there, letting the full truth settle into his bones. He felt connected to Ava in a way he had never imagined. Through her words, her choices, he finally knew her not just as the mysterious woman from one magical night, but as a person of immense courage, boundless love, and profound sacrifice. Slowly, Richard stood, holding the journal against his chest as though it were the most precious object in the world. In many ways, it was. It was Ava's love story for her daughters, a testament to her strength and her final gift to Richard, the chance to truly know her. Leaving the hospital, Richard felt as if he were emerging from a long, complicated dream. The world outside seemed the same. People hurried by. Cars filled the streets, but everything felt altered. His perspective, his heart, his future, all had been changed irrevocably. He set the box of Ava's belongings on the passenger seat of his car, carefully placing the journal on top. As he started the engine, he glanced at it one more time. He felt simultaneously shattered and whole, burdened by her sacrifice, and yet uplifted by her unwavering love. Driving through the early morning traffic, Richard replayed passages of Ava's journal in his mind. Her bravery in carrying the pregnancy, her loneliness as she faced a terminal illness, her hope that he would one day forgive her choice. Tears blurred his vision, but a newfound determination began to take shape within him. Parking outside his sprawling Sterling estate, he looked at the imposing structure he had once taken such pride in. Today, it felt cold and impersonal. No sum of money or symbol of success could comfort him. Only the two small souls inside could bring him the solace he so desperately needed. Exhaustion weighed on him as he crossed the threshold, yet beneath the fatigue, a sense of purpose burned brightly. He carried the box up to his room, setting it gently on a table. Then he headed straight for the nursery. The sun was just beginning to tint the sky with shades of orange and pink as he entered. The mansion's halls, once silent and sterile, now felt warmer, somehow transformed by the presence of the two tiny beings who had turned Richard's world on its head. Emily met him at the door, concern etched on her features. "They woke up a few hours ago and just went back to sleep," she whispered. "Ethan, are you okay?" Without speaking, Richard moved to the cribs. Grace and Chloe slept peacefully, their delicate faces calm, completely unaware of the emotional storm that raged within his heart. Gently, he touched Grace's cheek, then Chloe's. The tenderness of their tiny features nearly undid him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry I wasn't here from the start. I'm sorry your mother went through so much alone." Guilt gnawed at him. While Ava had faced anguish and countless medical appointments, he had continued his life, blissfully ignorant of the incredible sacrifice she was making. How could he ever make amends for that? Leaving the nursery, Richard returned to his office, placing Ava's journal on his desk. The once pristine workspace was now cluttered with baby supplies, bottles, blankets, small toys. For the first time, the mess didn't bother him. It felt real. It felt alive. As dawn broke fully, Richard sat in his chair, staring at the journal. The brevity of life, a concept he had rarely considered in his relentless pursuit of success, now loomed large. Ava had faced her own mortality with a grace and love he could barely fathom. What did it mean to be a father, to truly be a parent? Not just a provider, but a genuine, engaged presence. The answers he had once assumed were so clear: money, stability, opportunities now felt woefully inadequate. When the first rays of sunlight spilled across his desk, Richard made a decision. It was time to face not only his new reality, but also his past. A few hours later, he found himself in the living room of his parents' house, Ava's journal resting on his lap. His mother, Patricia, and father James watched him with concern. "Ethan, dear," Patricia began, "you startled us showing up unannounced like this." "I have something to tell you," Richard interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "About my daughters, about their mother." Over the next few minutes, Richard unveiled Ava's story. The encounter in New York, the unexpected pregnancy, her terminal illness. He read excerpts from the journal, her courage, her love, her selfless decision to protect him from her suffering. When he finished, a heavy silence weighed on the room. Patricia's eyes brimmed with tears. James's usually stoic face showed a deep, internal conflict. "Oh, Ethan," his mother finally said, pulling him into a hug, "what a terrible burden you've been carrying on your own." Richard let himself be held, feeling like a child again. "I should have been there for her," he murmured. She shouldn't have faced it alone. James, always the stern, pragmatic figure, surprised them both when he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Son, you can't change the past, but you can honor this courageous woman by being the best father possible to your girls." His father's words struck a deep chord. That was the truth. He couldn't rewrite what had happened, but he could ensure Ava's sacrifice was not in vain. "I want you to meet your granddaughters," Richard said quietly. "I want them to grow up knowing about their mother and her bravery." Patricia squeezed his hand. "We'd love that, dear. We're here for you, whatever you need." In that moment, Richard felt a shift within him. The crushing guilt still lingered, but it began to give way to a renewed, powerful resolve. He would honor Ava's memory, not just through words, but in every choice he made. In the days that followed, Richard embarked on a journey of personal transformation. He reassessed his priorities, reevaluated his relationships, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to be truly vulnerable. One sunny afternoon, he took Grace and Chloe to a nearby park. Sitting on a bench, watching other families at play, Richard had an epiphany. Life wasn't about amassing wealth or power. It was about connection, love, and leaving a positive legacy. Inspired by Ava's love for art, Richard began to see the world through new eyes. He spent hours describing colors and shapes to the twins, imagining how Ava might have done the same. He started visiting art galleries, hoping to understand the passion that had once lit up Ava's eyes. Back at work, Richard shocked everyone by announcing a major change in direction. The company would fund a substantial program for researching treatments for terminal illnesses and supporting families in need. It was his way of honoring Ava, of ensuring others didn't have to face her struggles alone. Late at night, after the twins were asleep, Richard often found himself paging through Ava's journal. Each word reminded him of her unwavering love for their daughters and the fierce determination with which she fought to give them life. Each reading brought him closer to her and strengthened his resolve. A month after discovering Ava's journal, Richard held a small ceremony in his garden. Close friends, family, and even a few of the doctors who had helped care for Ava gathered there. Beneath a clear summer sky, Richard shared her story, celebrating her life and the incredible legacy she left behind. Olivia taught us about unconditional love and about courage in the face of the impossible, Richard said, his voice quivering with emotion. Through Lily and Rose, her spirit lives on, and through our actions, we can honor the sacrifice she made. At the end of the ceremony, Richard planted 2 saplings in the garden, one for Grace and one for Chloe. Beside them, a simple plaque bore Ava's words. Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to truly find ourselves. As the guests began to leave, Richard lingered, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Being a single father, mourning a woman he never truly got to know, juggling immense business responsibilities, all would continue to challenge him. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Richard felt genuinely alive. He had been lost, yes, but in losing himself, he was finding something far more meaningful. With Grace and Chloe by his side, carrying Ava's spirit, he felt ready to face whatever came next. With a final glance at the newly planted trees, Richard whispered, "Thank you, Olivia, for everything." Then he turned and headed back to the house where his daughters awaited him, ready to embrace his new reality and the new man he was becoming. The sound of childish laughter now echoed through the once quiet halls of the Sterling estate, a stark and welcome contrast to the heavy silence that had once reigned there. Richard, seated on the floor of his former formal office, now a bright, colorful play area, smiled as Grace and Chloe, nearly a year old, explored their rainbow of toys. "Mr. Blackwood," Emily's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your video conference with the board starts in 5 minutes." Richard nodded, standing carefully so as not to topple the block tower he and the girls had been building. "Thank you, Sarah. Please ask Mar to watch over them." Making his way to his new, smaller office on the ground floor, strategically located near the twins' room, Richard reflected on the radical changes in his life over the last few months. Sterling Industries, once single-mindedly dedicated to profit and expansion, now had a greater, more profound purpose. Richard had shocked the corporate world by announcing the creation of the Ava Foundation, dedicated to cutting-edge lymphoma research and comprehensive support for families affected by terminal illnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began the meeting, his voice calm yet resolute. "The quarterly reports show that our new focus is not only ethically right, but financially sound. The Olivia Foundation has raised more funds than projected, and our single-parent support program is receiving international acclaim." The skeptical looks that used to dominate his board's faces had been replaced by a renewed, profound respect. Richard Sterling, once a ruthless shark in the business world, had become a visionary leader, skillfully balancing profit with purpose. After the meeting, Richard conferred with Dr. Elizabeth Wilson, the renowned oncologist he'd hired to spearhead the foundation's research efforts. "Ethan, the preliminary results are promising, Doctor," Wilson explained, her eyes alight with excitement. "The experimental treatment we are developing shows a 30% higher response rate than current protocols." A wave of complex emotions swept over Richard, too late for Ava, but potentially life-changing for thousands of others. "Keep up the good work, Elena," he said, his voice husky with feeling. "No expense spared we're going to make the difference Olivia dreamed of." Later that day, Richard visited the newly opened Sterling Support Center, a welcoming, warm space offering emotional, legal, and financial aid to single parents battling serious illnesses. Walking the halls, he observed support groups in session, children playing in specially designed areas, and volunteers offering guidance and a compassionate ear. This was Ava's legacy made real, transforming pain into tangible purpose. A young mother, a baby in her arms and dark circles under her eyes, approached him timidly. "Mr. Blackwood, I just wanted to say thank you this place, what you're doing, it's saving lives." Richard offered a gentle, understanding smile, recalling his own sleepless nights and moments of sheer desperation. "We're all in this together," he replied, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And I promise we'll keep expanding our support." Back at the Sterling estate, Richard found Grace and Chloe waiting eagerly. It was time for their favorite evening routine, story time before bed. Settling into an armchair positioned between their cribs, he opened a special book he had written and illustrated himself, The Brave Artist, a children's version of Ava's story. Once upon a time, he began softly, there was a very special artist named Olivia. She saw beauty everywhere she went and painted the world in bright colors. As he read, Richard watched the wonder light up the twins' eyes. They were too young to understand it all, but he was determined to keep their mother's memory alive, ensuring they grew up knowing her incredible courage and boundless love. After the girls fell asleep, Richard retired to his room, exhausted yet deeply fulfilled. On his nightstand, beside the photo of Ava, now stood a new addition, a portrait of the twins he had painted, inspired by her journal's descriptions of how she viewed art. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Richard reflected on the journey of the past months. The ache of losing Ava was still there, a constant, quiet companion, but so was the profound sense of purpose he had found in honoring her sacrifice through tangible, meaningful change. He thought about how much his very notion of success had evolved. Once measured solely by dollars and deals, it was now quantified by lives impacted, smiles restored, and hope rekindled. Picking up his tablet, Richard reviewed plans for the Ava Foundation's next initiative, a scholarship program for young, promising artists from underserved communities. It was his way of celebrating Ava's passion for art and ensuring others could express their creativity. As he fine-tuned the program details, he caught himself smiling. He could almost feel Ava's presence, her excitement at this project that so perfectly blended art and social impact. In the early hours of the morning, he wasn't working anymore. Instead, he was in a small art studio he had set up, brush in hand, creating a new painting. Still unfinished, it depicted two little girls walking hand in hand toward a radiant, hopeful horizon. Behind them, like a guardian angel, stood the faint, loving silhouette of a woman. When dawn's first light filtered through the window, Richard set his brush aside. In a few hours, Grace and Chloe would be awake, ready for another day of discovery and love. He would be there, present in every moment, fueled by the love Ava had left behind. Gazing at the incomplete painting, Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. His life had been rebuilt, given new meaning, and though challenges remained, he was certain he was on the right path. Glancing at Ava's portrait, he whispered, "I hope your proud will carry on your legacy one day at a time." With that, he prepared for another day, not just as a CEO or a philanthropist, but primarily as a father, committed to creating a better world for his daughters and for all those Ava would have wanted to help. The Sterling Estate's garden was alive with celebration. Colorful balloons bobbed in the gentle summer breeze, and the air was filled with the gleeful chatter of children and the warm conversation of grown-ups. In the center of it all stood a large cake, adorned with 6 candles, waiting for the big moment. Richard Sterling, now sporting a few more silver strands at his temples, surveyed the scene with a serene, contented smile. 5 years had passed since the night that had changed everything. Daddy, Grace and Chloe ran toward him, their party dresses fluttering behind them. "Can we open the presents now?" Richard crouched down, gathering them into a tight hug. "Not yet. My princesses, we have a special tradition, first remember." The twins nodded, their eyes shining with anticipation. Richard guided them to a quiet corner of the garden, where 3 chairs stood beneath the shade of a sturdy oak tree, the same trees he had planted in memory of Ava years ago. "Today," Richard began, his voice gentle yet steady, "I want to tell you more about your mother, Olivia." The girls settled in, one on each side of him. Richard opened a photo album he had carefully compiled over the years, filled with the few snapshots of Ava he'd managed to collect, plus his own paintings and sketches inspired by the stories he had uncovered. "Your mom was the bravest person I've ever met," Richard continued, turning the pages slowly. "She loved art and saw beauty everywhere she went." "Like us," Chloe exclaimed proudly, already showing an early, fervent passion for painting. Richard smiled, stroking her hair. "Exactly like you, and she loved you more than anything in the world, so much that—" He paused, choosing his words with care. "How did one explain Ava's ultimate sacrifice to 6-year-olds? She was very sick," he went on gently, "but decided to bring you into the world anyway, even though it meant she couldn't stay here with us." Grace, always the most sensitive of the two, frowned. "She didn't want to stay with us." "Oh, sweetheart," Richard said, hugging her close. "She wanted that more than anything, but sometimes love means making very tough choices. Your mother chose to give you both the chance to live and grow to be the wonderful girls you are today." The twins were quiet for a moment, absorbing his words. Then Chloe spoke, her small voice filled with a sudden, fierce determination. "So we need to live well, right, Daddy, to make Mommy proud." Tears stung Richard's eyes. "Yes, my love, that's exactly it." They spent a few more minutes going through the album, Richard sharing stories and memories. When they finished, the girls hugged him tightly before dashing back to the party, their young minds already refocused on the fun at hand. Richard watched them go, his heart brimming with a love and gratitude so profound it was almost painful. The ache of losing Ava would never entirely fade, but it had evolved into something meaningful, something that gave him purpose. Returning to the party, Richard was greeted by Dr. Elizabeth Wilson, now the celebrated director of the Ava Foundation. "Ethan," she said, her smile wide and excited, "I just got the news our new treatment has been approved. We're ready to begin widespread clinical trials." The announcement hit Richard like a wave of pure joy. After years of tireless research and massive investment, they stood on the threshold of a breakthrough that could save countless lives. "That's incredible, Elena," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Olivia would be so proud." As the party continued around them, Richard found himself reflecting on the last 5 years. The Ava Foundation had become a formidable force in medical research and humanitarian support. Their program for parents facing terminal illnesses now assisted families across the entire country. Sterling Industries, under its new leadership focused on social responsibility, was stronger and more respected than ever. Richard had proven that success in business could and should be balanced with a higher purpose. But his greatest triumph stood right there in front of him, in the form of Grace and Chloe. They were the center of his universe, his reason to strive for more compassion and understanding each and every day. With them, every day was a new adventure, a constant, beautiful reminder of Ava's love and sacrifice. Balancing everything wasn't always easy. There were still nights when Richard felt overwhelmed, torn between the demands of his career, his philanthropy, and his fatherhood. But in those moments, he would remember Ava's words from her journal. "Love is the most powerful force there is. It guides us, sustains us, and gives us the courage to face the impossible." As the sun began to sink, bathing the garden in a warm, golden glow, it was time to light the candles. Richard lit them, smiling at Grace and Chloe's excited faces. "Make a wish, my darlings," he whispered. While everyone sang happy birthday, the girls squeezed their eyes shut in deep concentration before blowing the candles out together. Applause erupted, but Richard barely heard it over the rush of love in his heart. Later, after the party had ended and the girls were tucked in bed, exhausted but happy, Richard wandered back outside. He strolled to the trees he had planted years ago, now grown tall and strong. "Hi, Olivia," he said softly, gazing up at the rustling leaves. "Our girls are growing so fast you'd be so proud of them. They have your spirit, your kindness, your creativity." He took a deep breath, the soft night air filling his lungs. "Sometimes it still hurts not having you here. But then I see everything your love has made possible, our daughters, the foundation, the lives we're touching, and I know you're with us in some way." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, as if in whispered response. Richard smiled, a profound and lasting peace settling over him. "Thank you," he murmured, "for everything." Heading back inside, Richard stopped at the door to the girls' room. Grace and Chloe slept soundly, their peaceful faces illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. In that moment, watching his daughters, Richard felt an absolute and unwavering certainty. The tragedy that had befallen him 5 years earlier had been transformed into something beautiful and profound. Ava's love, her sacrifice, had paved the way for a life filled with purpose, meaning, and immeasurable joy. With a heart full of gratitude and hope, Richard gently closed the door. The future looked bright, brimming with possibilities, and he was ready to meet it, together with Grace and Chloe, carrying Ava's legacy of love and courage forward every single step of the way.